Hi, Joms. Sorry. Speaking from Secretariat. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, hello everyone again. Oops, that was embarrassing. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for everyone who has joined our webinar this afternoon on the World Trade Organization and how it impacts women's human rights, especially in the current, in our current global context of the coronavirus pandemic. And today's webinar is it's an opportunity for us to discuss the implications of the current situation as regards probable major economic restructuring that we are facing in the light of the pandemic. But before we formally start with our webinar, I would just like to ask the EPWLB Secretariat, EB Hien, to discuss some stuff about housekeeping, our webinar rules, and I think I'll leave that to Hien.
Thank you, Joms. So hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. So when we are waiting for more people coming, could I invite you to join our Padlets where you can click on the link I just sent on the chat box, and you can type your email address, your name, your organization, country, and maybe also have like something you want to know from the webinar today. And when you click the link, you need to enter the password, and the password for it is the trade justice, and there is a space between trade and justice. So if you go to the chat box, you will see the link, and I also paste the password there. So for the webinar today, would like to invite you whenever you want to speak, please use, or whenever you want to enter the question, use the question and answer box, and we will have a dedicated section for that after our speaker delivers their speech. I think that, and also if when you speak, you don't speak, please unmute yourself and also turn off the video as well. If possible, please just like display your name by on the Zoom with your name and your organization. You can change your name and your organization name when you display it in Zoom as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Hien, for those reminders. So we're asking everyone to follow rules. It may be rules we want to follow, unlike some of the trade rules that the World Trade Organization and other trade agreements are ramming up the throats of many of our countries. So as we mentioned, the current coronavirus pandemic has revealed the interdependence of many countries and economic systems and global value chain the current trade and economic system has created. And it has also revealed how unfeasible and precarious this hyper-globalized world is, and how multilateral systems as a whole, such as the World Trade Organization, by playing a key role in creating and furthering this current global trade, has contributed immensely to the systemic failures of our current system. So since its establishment, the World Trade Organization has been facing a lot of resistance and critiques from many developing countries, from social movements, civil societies, including, of course, women's movements. And through the years, the Asia-Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development has engaged the World Trade Organization and other social movements, specifically to highlight and assert women's human rights in the context of trade rules and the hyper-globalized system that the WTO has attempted to spawn and create and further develop through time. So trade rules under the WTO, of course, has generated conditions that allow for channeling wealth and resources and power from poor and developing countries over to the rich, more developed countries, and of course, multinational corporations. And this is why, or this is the reason why many of us are critical of WTO impositions and economic restructurings. So this webinar this afternoon aims to provide a platform for feminists in Asia and the Pacific and for other members of the social movements in our region to exchange experiences and knowledge on the World Trade Organization and its impacts on women's human rights, especially in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the webinar this afternoon also aims to develop ideas for collective action that feminists and women's rights organizations and movements in the region can collaborate on to change the current unjust trade system that we are all in. So for this afternoon's webinar, we have 4 speakers to discuss on several aspects of the World Trade Organization and how it impacts on women's rights to food, health, on workers' rights, and also to also discuss how or what possible actions and vision that we can develop towards the feminist trade justice. So I'm now handing over the discussion to our first speaker for this afternoon's webinar. I'll introduce the rest of the speakers later before they speak, so we don't have like an overdose of introductions. But for now, let me introduce Ms. Sranja Sengupta, who works as senior researcher and coordinator of the trade program of Third World Network. Ranja, to many of us, know that her work spans agricultural institutions, international trade and investment policy making, globalization, poverty, and inequality. And Ranja currently works on global trade and investment policies, including those framed by the WTO and other free trade agreements and their impact on development priorities in the South, including, for example, agriculture and on the right to food, human development, employment and livelihood, and access to critical services. Ranja has also worked specifically on the impacts of global trade on women. So without further ado, may we hear from our first speaker, Sranja Sengupta.
Thank you, Joms. Hien, can you start the PowerPoint? Let me say that I'm so glad to be part of this webinar. I mean, we have worked closely with EPWLD on many of the issues. I work on trade policy, but you know, impact of trade policy on women and on gender dynamics has been one of my main interests. So the next slide, please. So today I am requested to speak on the food issue, the right to food and WTO. And you know, probably this is the probably one of the most controversial historical issues in the WTO. So right from the beginning of the WTO, the agreement on agriculture, which is the main agreement in WTO talking about agriculture and food issues, though there are other agreements like agreements on subsidies, on standards, etc., which also kind of provide the framework for how, you know, agriculture trade will operate under WTO rules. But the AOA still remains the big one, which was signed in 1995, one of the original agreements under the WTO. And that remains still one of the most controversial, right? So what happened under the AOA and the whole WTO's approach was, free trade is great, that the most efficient producer should supply to everybody because he will be the most efficient and the cheapest supplier. So it's for the benefit of the consumers, and therefore no country should put up any barrier at the border. Countries put up these import taxes so that they can protect their farmers, and any foreign product coming in will now pay that tax, so they will become more expensive. That makes them uncompetitive, and therefore that's how you can protect your industry, protect your farmers. And frankly, every country in the history of their agricultural development and industrialization have used import duties or tariffs. But the AOA said, firstly, eliminate or reduce all import duties. And the big issue in agriculture at that time, and in fact during the GATT days, was this huge subsidies that the Western countries used to give their agriculture sector. Until this date, they continue to give it. And it's not for small farmers, because in US, in EU, in Canada, these are big guys, right? This big agribusiness, and it has become bigger and bigger. And so they used to give these large export subsidies and domestic support. So basically the way they tempted developing countries into joining the WTO and the agreement on agriculture, they said, your interest is agriculture, great. Developing countries, you have competitive advantage in agricultural products, so you should sell that. We will eliminate subsidies. So that was the idea. Developing countries thought that the rich countries would eliminate the subsidies they give to their farmers and agribusiness, and therefore they'll get a better access to these markets. In fact, they paid through all the other agreement on services, the TRIPS agreement, which was very damaging for developing countries, and I'm sure Kate will talk about it after this. So they paid because they thought they would get gains from agriculture, but they didn't. Next slide, please. So the thing is, why? I mean, the first thing that they were told is that you see the cartoon. A poorer country or anybody who's disadvantaged cannot make up and get to the same level as a richer person, richer country, unless they're given preferential treatment, right? So they said, the WTO said, and especially during its Doha round, the developing countries will get special and differential treatment, which meant, longer implementation periods. They could keep some products out of, tariff cuts, and they would get a safeguard mechanism. But over the history of the WTO, we have not seen any of that materialize. There is very horrible, very harsh negotiations of each provision in special and differential treatment. So they give with one hand on paper, but on the other hand, there's nothing concrete that we've been able to get in sensitive products, special products, in the special safeguard mechanism. I'm not going into details, maybe we can come back. But now the US is saying no special and differential treatment unless for very poor countries. And the danger is they want to open up entire agricultural negotiations, taking out whatever little is there of special and differential treatment. So we are at actually a very dangerous moment. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Hien. Yeah. So basically, so you saw the three pillars. So the tariff cuts, because it became very controversial in agriculture, it still has not moved much. Some commitments in export subsidies, but US, EU, who were the main ones giving export subsidy, they had already started to cut it. So there was some deal reached in Nairobi in 2015 on export subsidies, but frankly, it hasn't hurt them much because they had already cut down a lot of their export subsidies. Big issue has remained domestic subsidies. So the rich countries, when they negotiated in 1995, and most of developing country negotiators didn't even know, like they didn't understand the complexity and politics of the negotiations. So the developed countries, because they were already giving high subsidies, they said, hey, we cannot cut so much. So they got extra AMS entitlements. I'm not going over all the numbers in detail. You can see in the slide, US, Japan, EU, many of these countries, about 17, they got these extra entitlements which developing countries didn't get. But then in the other part, which are called, amber box subsidies, which are supposed to be trade distorting subsidies, that if you give that subsidy to your farmer or companies, they get an extra advantage and they can undercut producers in other countries. So these bad subsidies, the developed countries were supposed to cut, but they didn't. You can see they have actually gone up. USA, EU, OECD, many countries, it has really gone up instead of going down. And then they shifted to green box. Green box is the type of subsidy which are supposed to be non-trade distorting. So countries were allowed to give these without limit. But frankly, a lot of research has shown now that these are really trade distorting, especially when the amount is huge. And it's huge in US and EU. So what they did was they showed that they're cutting the bad subsidies, but they moved them to the green box. And they kept giving it without limit. So, you know, there are interesting graphs that show as the bad subsidies come down in US, EU, the good subsidies are going up, but they are creating an equally disastrous impact in developing countries. Now they are asking developing countries to cut our subsidies, you know, which we give even for supporting public food programs, for very small poor farmers often get these subsidies, because for supporting public food programs, you need to get from farmers and then you give it to the consumers and you subsidize both, right? You give a market support to producers. They know they can sell to the public distribution system. But that subsidy, very small, is being challenged increasingly by developed countries. So you can see the numbers in this slide. You can see what a bizarre situation we are in. Rich countries, very high subsidies, total subsidies, and per farmer. This data includes the green box, because as I said, green box is actually really seen to be bad, especially when it's large. But developing countries, they are challenging, even frankly, India, China, which are bigger countries. If you look at the per farmer subsidy data, India gives $228 per farmer compared to US giving $68,910. Canada gives $16,562 and so on. So there is no comparison, but we are at this bizarre point, and that can only happen frankly in the WTO, that rich countries who are giving huge subsidies are not cutting their subsidies. They are turning around and telling poorer countries, you cannot even give subsidies like above a certain very kind of fixed WTO commitments that developing countries made in 1995. You cannot give anything above that, even to support poor farmers, even to support your public food programs. Next slide, please. Here, next slide, please. Yeah. So basically what we have seen is, coupled with the fact that, you know, the WTO has not managed to discipline subsidies, but it is asking developing countries to cut their only protection, which is import duty, a tax at the border. They're repeatedly pressurizing us that, oh, this is bad, you are protectionist, you should not do this, you are distorting markets. So some bit under the WTO, countries have already reduced, even though the WTO actually has not reached a final agreement on tariff cuts. But we are so scared about the WTO. Our governments are so keen to please the WTO that they have cut some tariffs at the border. But what we are doing, many of you know, we are cutting the tariffs in the FTAs. But we have not seen the cut in subsidies, which means Western subsidized products are still can come in, and they can still, you know, they are bringing in their subsidized products. We are removing our import duties increasingly under the different free trade agreements. Many of us are working on RCEP in the region. You know what huge pressure there has been to eliminate all tariffs on agriculture. And that is hurting farmers and small farmers in developing countries. A lot of research, including by UNCTAD, shows that, for example, in the Philippines, in the Cordillera region, John, you would know better than me, women rice farmers have got destroyed because European subsidized rice entered Philippines markets. In Africa, in cotton farmers, lives got destroyed. And a lot of our women farmers work as small farmers. They don't have much resources. If they may have small plot of land, or they work on family farm, women workers and farmers have all got hit. We are told women are getting jobs in agro-processing, which is developing because of WTO and all this, you know, great trade that's going on, but that is on very exploitative terms. And the big argument for free trade was what? Everybody, consumers will get food at the cheapest price. But frankly, we do not see, because there's a great mismatch between border price and when that price reaches local markets. So there's a lot of evidence now that this benefit, this promised benefit of low prices has not materialized so much. And apart from tariffs and subsidies, which the agreement on agriculture deals with, the WTO, I have no time to go into those things in detail because it's frankly, you know, agriculture and WTO and food, it's a gigantic issue. But IPR, the IPR TRIPS agreement and how it affects women seed keepers, and then investment. WTO initially it had just trade related investment measures, but now it's pushing big time for a multilateral investment facilitation agreement. And facilitation, everything comes in the name of facilitation, but frankly it means you open up markets to foreign investment. And we have already seen how FDI in agriculture and in natural resources has led to huge resource grab, land grab, water grab, forest grab, and that has had huge impact on women in rural areas who really kind of, you know, depend on these resources for their survival and their family's survival. And then now big thing is e-commerce. E-commerce is being pushed basically in the WTO, that, you know, the rich countries where the digital corporations, US for example, the corporations are based there in some of these countries and they have major interest. And we would think, oh, e-commerce has nothing to do with agriculture. But we know that that's not true anymore, right? Digital economy is everywhere. Monsanto is now saying it is a digital company, not an agriculture or a seed company. They are going to provide platforms through which all inputs and outputs will be traded. That means the digital companies are kind of, you know, exerting huge control, increasing control. Panasonic is producing food in Singapore, totally digital. So tomorrow we will not need farmers anymore if the digital corporations have their way. So what happens in e-commerce trade rules in the WTO will have huge impact on agriculture. And finally, gender and trade issue. You know, the WTO, maybe I think Azra will speak about it and we can come back about it. The big recent thing that has blown up in the WTO since 2017 is gender and trade. So suddenly the big guys are very concerned about gender and trade. Some of them may be having genuine interest. Some of these countries do work a lot on women's rights. But at the WTO, everything translates into hard commercial interest. So they're pushing the same agenda. They are saying e-commerce will benefit women. They're saying IPR, TRIPS Plus will benefit women. Investment will benefit women. So in the name of women, let us liberalize more, where there is a lot of evidence that this liberalization done under the WTO so far has not actually worked for women. They are not willing to take a critical hard look. We've been asking, what about the WTO agreements that exist? And what is the impact on women? There's tremendous adverse impact. Can you show it to us? They are not talking about the woman farmer, woman worker, woman patient. They're talking about big women entrepreneurs. So that's another thing to watch. And then finally, on COVID, how much time do I have left, Johns?
Wrap up, but maybe
okay,
another.
Okay, give me one minute, 1.5 minutes.
Okay,
right?
sure.
Sorry. So basically, now we come to COVID, and this, let's recognize, COVID is not the first crisis. It's a huge crisis, which is because of the gigantic nature of this crisis. It's making us realize how all the bad things we've done, and trade, we know, is clearly one which has led us to this. But COVID will not be the first crisis. It's not going to be the last crisis. We are going to have many major crises, and trade rules will be intrinsically linked. I think what the WTO has done is it destroyed the ability of developing countries and their farmers to produce food, because they have removed import duties, they have removed subsidies. They're asking us to remove all support we can give to our farmers. So they are now, what we are becoming, many countries which could produce food have become import dependent. Global markets are actually more concentrated. There's high speculation. So we are all hearing, right? You guys must have heard that we are on the verge of a food crisis, because there's been massive impact on food production, but also many countries are now dependent on imports for food consumption, and now imports are getting impacted. Countries are putting up export restrictions. There may be a major crisis, but we don't know how to deal with it. We can beg countries, don't put up export restrictions, at least ensure supply for poor countries, for very poor countries, but we don't know. And that's because the WTO has systematically destroyed our ability to produce food. But even now, if you look at what recommendations are coming out of the WTO, so a lot of recommendations, all for COVID, you know, different countries are tabling these statements and proposals, and they still say for agriculture, tariff cut. Remove your import duties to ease supply, which is weird because we need to become more self-sufficient in food production. And we need, so those countries which can produce, I'm not saying we should not trade, we definitely need to trade, we will export, but at the same time, in critical products, both medical products and food, countries will have to see how they can become more self-reliant, which does not mean that you give up your taxes, you give up your subsidies. But they are not addressing TRIPS. Why don't they address TRIPS? Access to medicine, TRIPS, access to food and seeds. No, the difficult issues where the big corporations have interest in keeping those, that they are not addressing, but they are still asking us to remove tariffs. So they are following and pushing the same agenda of liberalization using the COVID crisis. In the crisis, or remove tariffs, liberalize more because you will be better off. And that has not worked in the history of the last 25 years of the WTO. It's not going to work now. We need to work out our domestic policies on food and other products in other areas, and about policy, securing our policy space to develop the way we want. And women's groups can play a major role in supporting that agenda, I think. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ranja, for sharing with us WTO and how its agreements and rules have impacted on women's and the people's right to food, resources, and also impacted heavily on the economies of southern countries especially, and how agriculture and trade liberalization is being pushed even further by the WTO in the midst of this pandemic. I'm sure our attendees would have some questions for you. So if you have questions, we'll have a Q&A portion when our speakers, after our speakers speak, and also you can use the chat box of our Zoom webinar for some questions that you may have just before you forget all of them. So thank you again, Ranja, and for discussing on the right to food and the World Trade Organization. Now we move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker, especially to our members and network in the APWLD, our next speaker is not someone very familiar to us, having served as the regional coordinator of APWLD for many years, but she's now the regional secretary for the Asia and the Pacific region of Public Services International. So we have a feminist in the trade union movement in her person, and she has worked for more than 20 years in the promotion of women's human rights for organizations not only such as APWLD, but also for Amnesty International and the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission in her home country, Australia. She has been active in feminist refugee rights, trade union movements, in her many years as an activist and a feminist. So without further ado, I hand over the next speaking slot for our next speaker, Ms. Kate Lapin.
Thank you, Joms, and thanks for inviting me. Wonderful to see everybody and connect with all my sisters in APWLD's broader network and all our allies. I'm going to try and talk a bit about how the WTO undermines the right to health and drives health commodification. I'm not the kind of expert that Ranja is. I don't follow the WTO's meetings, but I think in a broader sense, it's part of the landscape of the global institutions that are driving neoliberalism. And so I'm going to try and talk about how the WTO drives that concept that now is infecting other trade agreements, and broadly has been seen as the orthodox way to approach health. And it's become, I guess, particularly clear right now that countries who have followed this advice about treating health as a commodity are really now struggling to address COVID. So whilst, of course, COVID wasn't something that countries could anticipate, they could anticipate that there would be pandemics, and we know that countries who have surrendered their capacity to both deliver public health and regulate health are doing much worse than those who have strong public health systems. I do have a bit of a presentation. I'll try and run through it, but let me just share my screen. Be able to do, can I, or do you need to authorize me to share my screen? It's not coming up for me. Here we go. All right. I think it's working. Right. Sorry, my computer might be a bit slow at the moment, but yeah, so let me start on a bit about how the WTO, I think, brings a particular idea of an economic system. And as Sranja mentioned, this is driving the liberalisation of all parts of our economy. So whilst a lot of discussion is, particularly now and always has been, around the role of the WTO in terms of the cost of medicine, I think even more broadly, it has introduced the idea that healthcare is a commodity. And so it's not just the TRIPS, which I will touch on, but also GATS, which is the idea that global trade in services, that healthcare is a service which should be open to the free market, which is, and therefore open to foreign private sector investment. And then there's also the areas of the WTO that deal with what are the trade barriers, and I want to talk about that a bit in terms of how ways to prevent health crisis are seen often as a trade barrier. So first of all, let me talk about the GATS, the Global Agreement on Trade in Services. So the health is listed specifically as one of those services that countries should open up and liberalise its market. And of course, you know, the opposite is true for what should be good public health, should in fact be not open to the private sector at all. But what's very clear in this crisis, but also if you compare any country's health data, its capacity to meet any global health indicators, that those who have kept health as a public good and invested in public health have been able to cope a lot better than those who leave it to the private sector. But this is true on a country level, but even more so on an international level, when smaller countries, low and middle income countries, are trying to compete with a global health system that is driven by profits. So the GATS specifically mentions 4 areas of health. So that's medical and dental services, the services that health workers provide. That might be cross-border as well, which I'll get to. Hospital services, which is obviously the big area that is most threatened at the moment, and then any other health and human services. So as you can see, they've really envisaged that every possible aspect of health should be liberalised and privatised. So the GATS agreement that has both sections in there that are applicable to all countries regardless of whether they exclude their health or not, and then there are those that are only applicable if those countries have agreed. So all countries are subject to the non-discrimination, meaning that they have to treat other country investors the same way as their own. So they can't say, oh, well, we opt out of that on health for health, and the transparency provisions. And then there are the provisions that say that must have market access. So that means that you couldn't say that we want to limit perhaps the number of private health facilities to only 10, or that we only want to limit a particular type of health service to local providers. So that you must open up that market access. And then there's the provisions which are really damaging to countries who have established a public health system, but also use some of that public health system to fund different primary and tertiary health services. And that is the national treatment provision, which means that if you are funding, if you have a public health system where part of your going to the doctor, for example, can be in part or full paid by the public health system, and then a foreign corporation wants to set up and provide that service, you have to fund them as well. And so you can't be funding, for example, local doctors who are outside of your public hospital system, but that would get some part of your public health costs, and not fund a large multinational who sets up a chain of doctors, tertiary doctor treatment or others. So there are, as I said, there are possibilities to exclude the government services or exclude part of this. But the way in which that is worded is so broad as not to be very useful. So the general clause there is that it excludes government services supplied that are neither on a commercial basis nor in competition with one or more service suppliers. So if you can imagine, there's not a lot, or very little in terms of health services that are not somehow provided, or there is no option to provide that on a fee-for-service basis. So this means that if anyone is already providing anything within that health field as a service, a fee-for-service, then it doesn't qualify here. So that's the GATS, and I think that partly is reflected in the trade agreements as well, in that it has commodified the right to health, that you can't treat health as a public good if you have the idea that it is driven by the market. And the TRIPS does the same, except with the concept of knowledge. So I think GATS is commodifying health services and saying that the market is the way to deal with it, and TRIPS is commodifying knowledge, not just health knowledge, but all knowledge, and that all knowledge must be traded and valued as its commercial value is how we protect knowledge, not its value to humanity or in this case, value to health. So they both come, I think, with that commodifying perspective. And this is obviously one of the areas that's being debated a lot right now around how are we going to find a vaccine and ensure that all people are able to get that vaccine. And I think what we've said is right now, it's not really a race to a vaccine, it's a race to profit from the vaccine. That's why we see so many different corporations teaming up to try and find the vaccine or other treatments, a range of treatments and a range of vaccines, and see who can get there without spending too much money in trials to profit from it. So that's the broad purpose of TRIPS, is to market or is to ensure that all knowledge is measured on its commercial parameter. Then all of the health issues that need attention are those, or the same impact in a country, in a rich country, then those treatments are dealt with differently. And so there's a range of diseases, even malaria, for example, where you might take it on a temporary basis if you were traveling, and that's commercially viable, but at long-term, a lot more malaria then might be a different need and doesn't get as much attention. I think the most discussed part of TRIPS in terms of medicines is that there are flexibilities, that members have the right to be able to declare that there are medicines that they need. They should be able to use flexibilities then and not have to, and be able to produce it as a generic. Now this, of course, is something that we all
Oops. I think we lost Kate. Okay, I'm seeing messages in our chat box saying that many can't hear, and I think we just lost Kate. Just when we were really, okay. Okay, Kate, hi.
sorry,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what happened there. And I don't know when I dropped out.
Okay.
Well, I just go back to where I was and then just keep going to the next part.
Okay.
I'm not sure if you heard me, but just so that I don't waste time, let me move on to the next part that I wanted to cover, which is that, so obviously health is not only about treatment, it's also about how do we create a healthy environment. Those things that not that we are not viral or that we don't catch, things like heart disease and obesity, and when governments have taken action to try and cases against them at the WTO. So there have been 93 cases when a government has tried to regulate because of the health risks that they pose, whether that be through the labelling, as I think famously we know that there's a tobacco case, and it was not just taken the initial cases through the trade agreement, but also through the WTO, and that has been a 10-year process and finally resolved last week. But that is a huge amount of cost in order to defend the right to label cigarettes. And in that time, in that 10 years, of course, a lot of countries haven't done it. And then there's quality standards. How do you, say that, well, we don't want foods that are going to poison people, or we don't want, we have to test the quality of alcohol or whatever it might be. the way that the WTO words this is that they must be the least burdensome possible.
Okay. Hi again, everyone. We're not quite hearing anything again from Kate. So as much as we would like to let Kate finish her presentation, I think.
Sorry, Joms, I am
okay.
here. For some reason, it muted me that time. So
Yeah.
let me try. I'm almost done. I'm almost done.
Yeah, and I think also turning off the video might.
Okay,
also,
good idea.
Yeah, but can we ask for to give you maybe 1 minute more to wrap up? So we
Sure.
can,
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, look, I just wanted to very quickly mention, and I won't go into detail, that clearly all of this has a significant impact on women's rights. Privatisation has repeatedly been shown to have the most negative impact on women, both in terms of their access to health, and when the higher out-of-pocket costs women have or families make, the first reduction is women's health and women's reproductive health. Because the market and societies are discriminatory, so that's having a these policies have the worst impact on women, and also that means that women then shoulder the burden of care as there's less and less publicly available healthcare. And I won't read this quote, but just, I mean, it's ironic that even the Beijing platform recognised that in the same year that the WTO was formed. I just refer you to the recent negotiations to try and open up e-commerce provisions within the WTO. We think that has enormous implications for health, and we've published something on that. So those of you who are interested could have a look at this new publication on the way that digital trade will undermine public health and other key public services. And finally, just on the recommendations, I think that I wanted to cover, I think these would be ones that echo some of what others have said, that now during COVID, we clearly cannot go ahead with further negotiations within the WTO or in any other trade negotiations. We right now need a global commitment for all treatments and vaccines for COVID to be universally seen as a public good, and to have compulsory licensing applied to all of them, and not country by country, but a global agreement to do that. And broadly, now as we have to come out of COVID with a new economic and social contract, and not one that sits within the WTO, but one that prioritises the capacity to care and for a healthy environment and healthy community. So thank you. I'm sorry about the connection, and I hope that's clearer.
Thank you again, Kate. Technological stuff seems to be very challenging, but we just still thank you for sharing your insights on how the commodification of healthcare, as pushed by the WTO, specifically agreements on TRIPS and GATS, has put immense disproportionate impacts on women and women's health, and also for other peoples of the global south especially. So there are some questions on our web chat that are particularly related on the topics you mentioned. So maybe in the question and answer portion, we can ask you to answer and give further insights. So now we're moving on to our third speaker on WTO trade agreements and workers' rights. Our next speaker is Ms. Daisy Arago from the Philippines. She is Executive Director of the Center for Trade Union and Human Rights, a labor rights organization engaged in monitoring, research, investigation, documentation, advocacy, and capacity building for unions, workers, and community organizations. Daisy has co-designed numerous worker-led data collection programs and campaigns with a focus on gender equality at the workplace. And she also conducted training on feminist participatory action research, specifically for the labor program of the APWLD. And Daisy is also part or focal person of the labor program of APWLD. So Daisy is a member of the Asia Monitor Resource Center Regional Council and has been involved in the International Solidarity Mission on mining and the Electronics Watch risk assessment on the ICT industry in the Philippines. So to speak on workers' rights and WTO, please welcome Ms. Daisy Arago.
Yeah, thank you, Jones. That's a very generous introduction, and I hope everyone indulges with that so generous introduction of mine. So thank you, everyone, for inviting me to this webinar, and also I am also thankful that the first two speakers have also touched on the trips and also in terms of the GAD. So that saved me a lot of time. Yeah. So I have a short slides that I would like to share in terms of why we are always against the neoliberal restructuring in re-engineering of our economy, not only here in the Philippines, but in Asia, especially in Asian region and all especially the developing countries. So can I ask the Secretariat to please share? So while Rachita is preparing the slides, so I would like to touch on more on terms of the agreement of the WTO from the very beginning to until now, which highly impact especially the workers, and why led to the informalization of workers, especially amongst women. So where is it? Yeah, so WTO and impact on members, so the screen is on the trade related investment measures that highly impacts on us. So everything that trips and other things that in case of liberalization of economy that has something to do with investment, and investments in every aspects of the economy has also reflected on the conditions that the workers are having from the very beginning of the WTO up to present, and even worse during the pandemic. Where's my screen? So okay, so let me walk through very quickly on terms of the especially that affects on in terms of the workers' rights. On the I have already mentioned the TRIMS, the trade related investment measures, and the previous speakers have touched on the TRIPS, GATS, and even the role of the FTAs. And in most countries, what is the role of the export processing zone or special economic zone that used to be a temporary measure and now a permanent strategy in compliance with WTO conditions of liberalizing our economy. So many of the investment measures before, we are using the export processing zones as temporary measures of many developing countries to boost exports. According to WTO, when you liberalize, when you open your market, you create employment, and under the pretext of free trade. So when WTO came to being in 1995, all these export processing zones were changed in order not to discriminate the foreign investments or the multinational corporations, to align with the conditions of WTO of not discriminating the multinational corporations in terms of the in terms of export, of boosting exports in our country. And we know that in many special economic zones, 30 to 50% of the workers are unprotected. We know everything that workers' rights, these are the zones where workers' rights from wages, security of jobs, and flexible working hours, and long working hours, and even safety of workers are they are not protected despite the pandemic. So we always call the workers the economic frontliners during this crisis of pandemic or the pandemic. I don't know whether the slide, what happened to the slides, but yeah. So we have been under WTO economic system and trade regimes for almost 30 years and 25 years of WTO, and all everything that production was made in our country, especially developing countries, are productions and mass, and production should be for export not only not only to pay your foreign debt, but in terms of boosting the economy or boosting the exports of developing countries. And in boosting the economy or the export, then you will expect the country will expect GDP growth. Everything is as redesigned or defined by the growth that the country is for kind of pursuing in every economic decisions. So in terms of the impact, we see that, as Sranja has discussed, growing dispossession of land and resources, especially in terms of opening the country in the use of land. So we see a massive land conversion in every country, different names, economic land concession, special economic zone, and other, where investments have been opened out for foreign investors. We also see a lot of destructions of environment, as discussed also, but it also the in following and in complying the WTO conditionalities. Most governments impact caused the increase in internal and external migration. So we see that in the before WTO came into being, external migration or migration from outside the country was a temporary strategy. Now it has become a kind of permanent strategy in terms of the GATS, wherein mostly the low-paid migrant workers are servicing and covering for the production and mass in order to the growth-led economy came into being. We also see, while we increase flexibilization and precarious labor. So instead of creating or job security or creating employment to in other countries, we are seeing many workers are actually becoming flexible and becoming precarious, and especially women. Women workers are hardly hit from dispossession of land and resources. Women internally migrate to the cities, to the urban areas, and they all became special economic zone workers or export-led companies to developed countries, mostly developed countries. We also see the growth of, yeah, as I've said, the growth of informal sector. Informal sectors that includes the ambient vendors and everything, and drivers. And in Philippines alone, there are 15.6 million are actually we could today can be considered informal sector. And the World Bank, which is one of the designer of our own economy, says that 75% of our labor force are actually informally employed and do not have any hope to be gainfully employed. And everybody knows that one of the impacts of following and complying of our government is in terms of the growing poverty and hunger, and increase in several folds, especially during the pandemic. Of course, we know that the ILO has already declared that 25 million has lost its job in every country, and most economic zones are prompting or forcing or actually encouraging their workers to go back to work, and all the precautions, protections, and protocols for health are not well in place, and they are being sent home. And so in terms of not only on the loss of income and livelihood. So how are they made possible? You see, we can see that from 1995 up to present, we continually see the changes in laws in terms of the not only investment laws, but also in labor laws. The pandemic is being used and utilized to cut or undercut the labor laws or not to comply with labor laws. So several regulations under the pretext of COVID-19 were saying that the already flexible workforce are already allowed because of the job losses are or to get 2 to 3 days or some to work more than 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours. So we are seeing that during this pandemic, many of the labor laws were suspended or are suspended. Women, especially healthcare, in terms of the although they are doing or saying things and doing different things in terms of the protection. So an example of those, they are in terms of investment measures, in terms of there are many, and also the regional trading agreements, also the FTAs, the free trade agreements in different countries which are in cutting trade. It has to be aligned with the conditions and also with policies and rules of the WTO. For example, the Asia in Southeast Asia, although there are bilateral agreements amongst countries, we are seeing also the cutting of tariffs in some of usually the protective areas, like for example the sugar, in terms of automotive. So there are many, and WTO is very powerful in the sense of the dispute settlement between countries, those which and who are perceived to be violators of those conditions. An example of the impact of the under WTO, like for example in terms of women, in 1995 when in the Philippines when we acceded to WTO, we can see that the percent share of women in terms of the percentage share in economy in 1995 was 36%. But in 2017, we can see that the women, especially in services and migration, that includes those in the household and then small stores and those who are selling, are increasing. So there are more, it becoming more feminized industry than in other compared to the other sectors. In terms of employed population, in 1995, we have seen the higher percentage of women are employed. But now also in the services, more women are so-called employed but are precarious because they consider the precarious, including the ambulant vendors who are also are considered employed. And we can see that in terms of labor participation rate, the women in 1995, there are 48.5% of women in terms of populations who are in the labor force. But this is now it's 46.2% of women populations are in the labor force. So more and more women are not considered in the labor force and put in that in the labor force. And even in the union, if we see in 1995, when we acceded to WTO, women who are represented in the unions who have access to organizations are represents 27%. But in 2017, only 5.3 of the population of employed women who are considered wage and salary workers are also in the union. So we can see that in more and more, it is not true as we have experienced that there are more unemployment, especially amongst women, and most women who are in the productive ages or reproductive ages like 15 or 34 are not considered unpaid, taking care, and those are unpaid kind of sectors. We also see that now during the pandemic in Southeast Asia, for example, women and LGBTQIA plus are hit hardest because they comprise the 70 to 60% of garment exports, and especially economic zones like garments and electronics, as well as the informal sectors. They not only lose their jobs and income, they are also um, there's no program for them on how to cope with the loss or the economic losses, even the social echo. They are also not socially not protected. They are prone to domestic violence. They are in terms of suffering or experiencing mental distress, and there's no program for them. They are mostly excluded in the social protection of our, whether in official or non-official. So many, they are left, most of most of the time they are left to fend off for themselves. So what happened to during the pandemic, as I have said, the pandemic also offer opportunities for us. So I don't want to see it in a very negative way, because most of the governments, especially in Asia, have left most people, most of their citizens to attend to the needs by themselves. It also offers opportunities for us to be in solidarity, to explain to them quite hopefully and quite expectedly easily how the pandemics have built the solidarity between us, and also the value of solidarity amongst people, especially amongst those the marginalized people. They are better positioned now to be in solidarity with another, and easier for us to explain the failure of WTO in all its 100 plus agreements. And it doesn't create wealth, it only creates wealth for, as you have said this beginning, creates wealth for those who are wealthy, and especially for the corporations. So what do we need? I think this pandemic, despite the distress that is causing us, it also, as I have said, it's it's also an opportunity for us to explain that there should be, well, it's, if it's not a reversal, that should be a change in the trading system. It is up to us to explain to the people that the trade regime that we have will not be reliable, dependable. In fact, it's causing our poverty and also hunger. So we need the system, one that places the worker at the center of our system, especially the workers who are economic frontliners. And everybody recognize now the importance, the value of the workers, but not the workers' rights, because the workers' rights is a kind of thing that can be compromised according to them because of the pandemic. So we see that the all labor standards, they are being neglected intentionally by many governments, and they are focusing more on the protection of the economy, but not the protection of the workers. So we need a system also that is sustainable. I mean, the pandemic has offered us with less pollution according to the environmentalists, but it also a way to say that this system, the system that we have now, is not working to protect our environment and even the climate. And we need a system. It's easier, and hope it is easier for us to explain that any development should place the people, the marginalized sector, at the center, and justice must prevail in our system. That in the trade, all these failures, when it was difficult or challenging to explain that WTO and its prescription fail, and the pandemic underscores its failure. So it is a chance for us, especially in the civil society organizations, to claim that smallest space for us to do our advocacy work against WTO and all its prescriptions and conditionalities, and even its system of the economic system. So I think with that, and I am grateful that the two speakers have mentioned other aspects of the agreements. So yeah, so that's all. Thank you. Bakit hindi?
Thank you, Daisy, for that presentation and for discussing how women and workers are being impacted not only by the World Trade Organization, but how job insecurity and working in precarious conditions are all heightened because of the pandemic and the system's failure to protect the rights of workers. So thank you for that presentation, and we're now have come to our last speaker. But before I introduce our last speaker, just please note everyone that we are a few minutes over time. So we might adjust the question and answer portion, but we have gathered some of the questions already mentioned, and we will still allot some time for our panelists to answer those questions. So just please wait it out. And so our last speaker to discuss about calls for trade justice, what actions and alternative can be looked into is Azra Talat Said. She is Azra is founder and executive director of Roots for Equity in Pakistan. She's also regional council member and program organizing committee member of EPWLD's Women Interrogating Trade and Corporate Hegemony, or WITCH program, which is sponsoring this webinar, and for which I also have been working with Azra in. And Azra has been actively advocating women's human rights in her many years as an activist, and she has written and presented extensively on the impact of imperialism and neoliberal globalization on the masses in Pakistan and elsewhere in the world. So without further ado, Azra, you may now speak.
Thank you very much, Joms. It's really, really wonderful to be here, and thank you to WITCH and APWLD for inviting me to speak. I would also like to thank all the three previous speakers, starting from Ranja to Kate to Daisy. Each one has brought out a particular element of WTO very clearly. The WTO was formed in 1995, and there have been just the widest, most humongous protest resistance to WTO, and farmers in Asia have just said, junk WTO. We do not agree to WTO in agriculture. That has been the clearest clarion call of farmers, not only in Asia, but across the world. And the concept that was given in its place was, especially with respect to agriculture, was we talked about food sovereignty. And we have embraced and increased the entire length and breadth of what WTO is actually all about and what is food sovereignty in response to WTO. So this has been ongoing for the past 25 years. And in the COVID period, and even before the COVID period, actually, in the past 4 to 5 years, with the turn of the century, next slide, please. I think what we have come to is the concept that we are not talking about a trade body anymore. We are not talking about the World Trade Organization anymore. We are talking about something entirely different. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so what are we talking about really? We are talking about slavery. And this is a very apt time to talk about slavery, given what is happening in the United States. This poster I found on the web, and it says very clearly, you know, it has different prices for slaves, for people coming from Africa. The men had a different price, the women had a different price, and the children had a different price. So you can see, they used to bring them as commodities. They used to say a lot has come, a cargo has come, and it is composed of men and women, boys and girls. And I've lost that slide. I'm very sorry about it. I can't find it anymore. But it also used to say the price separately for women and boys and girls and men. And so WTO to me always has been this understanding that it is nothing but a slave trade. Can I go to the next one, please? Next slide. Okay, so to me, the very next thing is what we have done in Asia. We have talked about in response to what is happening in the trade regime, we have really gone and talked about development justice. That has been the vision that has been propagated by feminists in our region. We have talked about justice across the breadth and realm of society. We talk about gender justice, and so we don't use the word gender justice, we use social justice, because social justice also encompasses so much more. And from there, we talk about economic justice, environmental justice, and then we also talk about redistributive justice. And finally, the most critical pillar of society has been accountability to the people. Hein or somebody, if you can hear me, how come the slides are not changing? Hein, Diana, are you guys there? Can anybody tell me? Hi,
Hi,
can you hear
Azra.
me?
Yeah. Sorry, just a little bit of technical problem. I will share the screen. So you will go with the next slide, photo, is it?
The hand slide of APWLD, and then very quickly to the next one. So this is the model, the vision that APWLD had floated in the past 4 to 5 years. And this is exactly the demand that women have made of development justice. This was also in line with the 2015 agenda, the SDGs, which they came to be known as later, the Sustainable Development Goals. But in the past few years, I think we have to go further than even this. And because I was reading on development justice, and I was thinking, do we just want to decrease the disparities between the rich and the poor? Or do we want something else? Can you go to the next slide, please? Because the WTO is a killer. You know, WTO is like COVID-19. People have been making monstrous pictures of COVID-19 and all of that. And it took me back to 1995 when we were making these very, very grotesque pictures of the WTO. And the WTO is equal to imperialism. You know what we mean when we say imperialism? It means I can't breathe. That's what it means. It means we have no right to breathe. We have no right to life. And that is what the WTO exactly means. I was listening to Sranja very carefully. And what did she say? She said, they destroy our capacity to produce. They destroy our absolute capacity to produce. And then they make us, they force us, take away the tariffs, which would not allow their products to come into our countries. These two terms in itself is equivalent to imperialism. That's what imperialism means. When we do not have the right to decide for ourselves. And that's exactly what the WTO has done. It says, don't produce, we will sell you every damn thing on earth, whether it is product or services, whether it is health or education or e-commerce, as Sranja was talking about. So in essence, they have made sure that we open up our markets of thousands and billions of people who live in the third world countries, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They will provide everything. That is imperialism, friends. And then they say, people have to work. I loved it. Daisy said, everybody recognizes workers, but not workers' rights. Yes, that is absolutely true. The bloody capitalists, a vast majority of whom are still part of the European continental, of the North American continent, and Australia, of course, and others who are part of the G7 bloc. They want us to open our markets for their products. They want to take our resources. And as Kate said, they want to commodify knowledge. So what is left? We can't eat, we can't breathe, we have no environment, we have no access to our own resources, to our own land, to our own seeds. So where do we stand? And I think I would like to comment on Ranja's point of women. I think women are now in the front line of the bloody capitalist front. They have used us right and left. Suddenly the USAID, the Monsantos, the Nestle's, the European Union is so worried about women's rights, you know, as if everybody in our continents is, the women are browbeaten, they can't speak for themselves, they have no agency. Every one of them is coming to liberate women in our continents. I would like to tell them we are liberated. We do not want these bloody agencies in our countries to liberate our women. We are capable of liberating ourselves, and we will do it. The point is, okay, where do we go from here? I think we have to go to a society which is self-sufficient. The COVID-19 has very clearly proven everything which the activists across the globe, whether it was the United States of America or the European countries or women from Asia and Africa and Latin America, wherever we were saying we want self-sufficiency. Can you please go to the next slide? And yes, that is why I truly believe we should not anymore talk about equity. We should not talk about let's get our rights. I think we should just talk about imperialism. We should talk about the source of power that these countries have, which is military, which are the bombs that they scare us with. And the other source, which nobody talks about, or only we in the feminist circles talk about to some extent, are the elite, are the very corrupt elite that they have placed in our countries, who are willing to trade our bodies, they are willing to trade our lands, our minds, our children, everything that we have, they are willing to trade it with these colonial powers. It is now very clear what is happening. We have a number of imperialist countries who are now fighting among themselves, and they will bring that war into our lands. They have already carried out an economic war for many, many years. And now you can see the signs of the military war also coming very clearly. And we, the women, really believe that we can stop them. We have the power to stop them. We may seem very weak, we may seem women who have to cover our heads, and we have to bow to these bloody men, whether they are landlords or feudal lords or capitalists. But let me tell you, we may do it to protect our bodies from vicious beatings, but we know exactly how to kill them and stop them where we need to stop them. And so to me, the last thing which I would really like to say is, can you please go to the next slide?
Hi, Azra, can you tell me which is the next slide? Because this is the last one.
Oh, really? It says no justice, no peace.
Okay, I'll just like pull it up.
Never mind. So, you know, the Black Lives Matter and many of the protests that were being carried out in the US and then across Europe also in solidarity with the Black Americans was no justice, no peace. And I totally agree that we don't want peace. We, the women, do not want peace. We will not let our name, not in our name. Remember, there used to be a slogan, not in our name. And yes, the Americans, the Europeans, everybody is talking about women's rights. Yesterday, there was a webinar by CARE International, the American NGO, and FAO, and God knows, every white man was sitting. There were 5 panelists talking about women's rights. They were all men. They were all, most of them were white men. There were some others from, I think, Africa or Asia. But they were men. How can CARE put up a webinar to talk about women's rights and only call men as speakers. I was like, I could not believe it. And the word which Ranja talked about, entrepreneurs. Now, women don't have food to eat, but of course, we can be entrepreneurs. We know how to sell stuff. First of all, let us bring you to Europe and Americas and everywhere else and sell our bodies first, right? Domestic workers, migrant workers, whether it is the Arab world or it is Europe or it is other parts of the world where migrant workers are treated as slaves. So this is the last thing I want to say. I think we now need to go beyond just thinking in terms of the politics of trade, because we have to now go further than trade. I know we talked about trade and corporate hegemony under the WICH program, and that is very true. And I'm very, very happy that Ranja was able to lay it out so clearly. What are they after? We can have no peace. There is no time for peace anymore. There is only now a period of struggle, a period of knowing that many of us will be killed. They have unleashed pandemics. I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory, whether the Chinese have made it or the Americans have made it, whether it has come through the deforestation of wildlife and all not. The point is, it is their way of life that has leashed a very minute, something we can never see with our eyes, an enemy which cannot be beaten by tanks, by rockets, by atomic bombs, by the millions of bases that are all over the world. 800 military bases of the United States cannot kill and stop the pandemic. That is a fact. And we will now, each one of us, we will now become the coronavirus and we will wipe them out. That is what I believe is now the call of the time. There is nothing that they have not used to kill us, nothing, to take away our dignity, to take away our lives. When every time they used to show that gentleman under the knee of that white man, and people started saying, I can't breathe. You know, I used to think, that's correct. I can't breathe. And this is what they have brought us to. But we will breathe and we will wipe them off the face of this earth because they will destroy our world as we know it. And the only choice, the only choice we have left is to make sure that our entire activist bodies across the globe have only one word on our mind, and that is we will defeat the imperialists wherever they are, whether they are in our continents or they are in other continents of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Azra, for those powerful words and moving words, also calling on our collective action to take governments and also trade organizations like WTO to task for the multiple burdens that women and the people are facing because of these trade agreements. So we are now 4 minutes over time, but I think it might still be good to, we think it's still good to answer a few questions that many of you have written in our chat box. So what we're going to do is to give a last round of short, brief statements from our speakers, but please take note that there are some questions that may be answered. One, there's a question about policy solutions that governments can take on. What are those possible policy solutions that governments can take on to protect the rights of farmers? And there was also a question about if a binding treaty on business and human rights could address some of issues, particularly on labor, by looking into ILO labor standards and environmental standards. And there was a third question about how do we as a people ensure or maybe take the WTO to task to ensure that the rights of women. So may I ask the speakers, our four speakers, to give their final statements before we close the webinar, and please take note of specific questions that you may want to address. Sranja has mentioned about answering some of the specific questions on farmers' rights. After we give maybe a brief 1, maximum 2 minutes for each speaker for your final statements, can we just ask our participants to stay on for another minute for some housekeeping and yeah, few questions from the organizers. So yes, please. We start with Ranja.
Thanks, Joms. And I've already been trying to answer. There were so many interesting questions. I've been trying to answer some in the chat box and the question answer box. But quickly, I wanted to answer the question on a national policy for supporting farmers. Now, we can ask, we can ask for a better credit policy, crop insurance, and, infrastructure, and so on. But I think the 3 big things would be: one is access to natural resources, which means land, water, and other natural resources for farmers so that they can continue to produce. Second is we want access to inputs like seeds and pesticides or whatever. I mean, we are all not in favor of these horrible chemical pesticides, but at least the inputs that farmers need. And then the third would be access to markets. Now you see the WTO agreement on agriculture, but also what we talked about, IPR will threaten access to seeds. Investment agreements are massively threatening access to land and natural resources. So I think if we do not challenge the WTO, and not only WTO, the investment agreements, the free trade agreements in their entirety, because what they do is they have multiple agreements, multiple topics, multiple chapters, and they all support and reinforce each other. So I think that, the threat to agriculture would come through many agreements, many chapters. So unless we challenge and just change that whole framework altogether, we actually cannot have a national policy that can support our farmers. And I think Sarah had put up an interesting question about how national and local governments are also corrupt and how they are actually having bad policies. If we have bad rules in WTO, that will give support to our corrupt governments. And we know now, from rich countries to poor countries, most of our governments are terrible and they're looking for opportunities. So WTO with bad rules will give them the perfect opportunity to implement bad policies, and basically which helps a few rich people even in developing countries, and it leaves out the massive lot of poorer people. On business and human rights, I'm not sure it can it can do all the work that we could see from a positive institution on trade, which is not the WTO. A lot of questions also about the future of the WTO, given the challenge posed by the US, the collapse of the dispute settlement, the appellate body, the collapse of the dispute settlement mechanism. And there's a lot of using this opportunity. The developed countries have pushed in this WTO reform agenda. And now all members, whether they like it or not, have to play that game of the reform of the WTO. The thing is, the interesting thing is, civil society activists, we have always asked for a reform, either to junk the WTO, that the WTO is simply not working, as Azra said, but also, or at least to have a reformed institution which would work. But we have not seen any hope for that in so many years. So the danger is this big reform discussion is going to give us a WTO 2, which is even worse than the current WTO. That we have to prevent. So we could do with a new institution. I don't know whether it will look like a business and human rights treaty. Thankfully, business and human rights treaty is already putting trade and investment, particularly investment agreements and ISDS, etc., in its reference. But I am not sure whether it could replace, but we definitely do not want another WTO which looks like this, or worse, which would be even a worse, much worse institution, keeping only developed country interests in mind. And at the moment, there is a danger that's going to happen. We really need to organize like big time to prevent that. Thank you.
For those words and for keeping us reminded of the work ahead, what we still need to do in all this. So Kate, maybe can we ask for your final statement, and if there are maybe
Okay,
some
sure.
questions on the labor rights that you may want to answer.
Just to follow on from what Ranja had said about reform and about the treaty and how we better protect labour and public services. I think the WTO is a symptom of a broader problem. It's a symptom of neoliberalism. It emerged to cement one single economic model around the world, and it's not the only institution that does that. And of course, the trade agreements are building on the WTO and going even further. But we also have the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and other regional institutions who are doing the same. And I think what COVID has shown us, that times of crisis have always led to significant changes, social, political, economic changes. The institutions we have were often born out of crisis. The UN came out during the Second World War, as did the World Bank and the IMF. And this crisis has shown us that we need a whole new global architecture to protect rights, to protect human rights, but also and to recreate the way that we organise societies. So, I guess what COVID says is that capitalism is entirely incapable of dealing with crisis. Nobody has, wanted to leave the situation to the market in every country, even the most neoliberal countries. The state has had to step in, and the people that we appreciate are those who are delivering services. Whether health workers, whether it be the people that deliver our food, or whether it be workers that still have to continue to give us energy and water, or agricultural workers, they are the backbone of a functioning society and economy. And I think that's where this opportunity lies, is that we can all see we didn't miss the hedge fund managers, did we? Or Wall Street traders, and they're the ones benefiting. So the binding treaty, I think, would only be a symbol of a broader shift. We already have a whole range of obligations that states have through the UN human rights architecture, and they have never, because states have shifted their focus and their obligations to corporates, to the elite, to the most powerful in who can exercise that power. Those other obligations have been rendered irrelevant. So I think that's where we are. We really need a shift. The WTO should become irrelevant, but it can't be replaced by the trade agreements or just the same sort of structures represented elsewhere. And for me, I think that the main way is really the things that we're trying to do to mobilise more workers, obviously to join unions and to collaborate between social movements, hopefully to also do that at a national level and shift governments and use this crisis as an opportunity to deliver a whole new social contract.
Thank you, Kate, for those words. And I think many of us here in the room would say challenge accepted to continue fighting and asserting women's rights amidst all this. So Daisy, can we hear from you?
Yeah, I just want to echo what you said of challenge accepted. I think in every crisis this crisis has told us that we need to, as I think I might use the same word, create of a new system. We need to retool a system, not just the reform of WTO. I mean, WTO is only one of the many pillars of neoliberalism. In terms of not, in terms of recreation, is meaning we need to reverse. Capitalism has failed us. It has brought us marginalization. So it's a better system that will include the marginalized, or put the marginalized at the center when we do the recreation. So in every crisis, an opportunity always brings us to strengthen our resolve. Of course, it's difficult, but we should not lose sight of what we want, especially for the workers, for the farmers. And the question of, maybe I just want to comment, being a farmer myself, used from a farming family, I think what we need is, in terms, is not only access to land, but it also in terms of ownership of the land for the farmers. I mean, farmers have difficulty in terms of producing the food because they don't have the land. So it's not only that they have don't access, means ownership also. The binding treaty on business and human rights might help, but it's not an answer to every kind of violations that we are experiencing, from labor to environment to everything. So I would say that it's a challenge, especially in terms of organization. And how do we organize, especially in this time where we only see the screen, and where physical distancing is always observed and it's so difficult. So we need to reinvent ourselves, even in the CSO. What would be the creative possibilities or creative ways of organizing people, of mobilizing people in it's a challenge. I don't have very ready answer for that, but it's a challenge for us of how to organize, of how to build movements around the failures of capitalism or WTO in this time of pandemic. How do we organize? I think it's the first challenge we have to answer for ourselves. Thanks. Thanks for your questions, and thanks everyone for this opportunity.
Thank you to Daisy for gracing this webinar and for reminding us of the need for more far-reaching actions and retooling of the current system that has failed all of us. And lastly, may we hear from Azra, parting words, Azra, some more inspiring message you have for us.
I would just like to say that it's not only, certainly not only WTO. So to me, it always is the many organs of capitalism, of colonization that is still going on, that we need to study and know very well. I think what was so impressive about each of our presenters was that they knew the matter, they knew what they were talking about. And when we go into rural communities, when we go to urban poor communities, and when we have to tell them why WTO is bad, why the IMF and the World Bank are the way they are, why our people, our farmer, our elite are getting richer and richer, and we are getting poorer and poorer, we need to have some amount of very critical, clear-sighted facts. And so I think, for me, resistance is the key word. But resistance based on a very clear research and investigation of the people's realities and what they are going through, and then connect that to the policy. There is the only way that this planet will survive is when we beat capitalism, when we beat imperialism. And we need to understand what imperialism is, what are the different, many clinging hands, of parasitic hands that that system has of imperialism. And if we don't smash that, we are in for a very bad time. We are already in for a very bad time, but it will only get worse. Joms, you said it cannot get worse. I think it can get worse. It can get much more worse. So unless we fight, we are very, very enterprising. We are very, very, very vigorous women and men, brothers and sisters, workers. We can come together and we will smash them. So I leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Azra. It will not get worse, I think, if we fight on and reunite and rise up against the system and all the agreements, policies and rules that keep the system alive. So with that, I would like to thank everyone again, our four speakers, the APWLD Secretariat for helping out and organizing this webinar also. And all those, of course, most especially our attendees for this afternoon's webinar. And before we end, I will give the floor to Hien for some reminders and some appeal to our participants to, so Hien.
Yep. Thank Joms, thank panelists and wonderful participants. So I just thank you very much for staying in. So just like 30 seconds more. So we will show you the poll so that we will learn from you, your experience, and from that we can learn to organize better and more wonderful webinar in the future. Thank you very much. You're supposed to see it on the screen and just like to click. That's all we expect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hien. Thank you again, panelists and participants. And please don't forget to answer the poll. And we hope that in the future, we see each other, maybe not virtually or otherwise, as we work for women's human rights, trade justice, and a better society for every one of us. Thank you.